Welcome to the Vernuccio Novak Report and the American Political Zone. From New York, this is Frank Vernuccio.
And from Washington, this is Daria Novak.
And Daria, the world, of course, is at pins and needles over what is happening in Ukraine. Off air, we were talking about the question of Vladimir Putin's sanity. Basically, it came one from an attack that really gains nothing for his Russia. If he takes over Ukraine, it's just going to be a troublesome province, which is going to continue to beset him. When he's challenged on it, when the West has said you shouldn't be doing this, he's threatened nuclear retaliation. Daria, is this man sane or not?
If you look at it from the point of view that his whole life he's been paranoid, he's been a member of the KGB, he's specialized in misinformation, disinformation, and propaganda for his country, he's probably moving along the same lines. But today he has more power. Today versus even a decade ago, the Soviet Union, now today Russia, has weapons of mass destruction that are very advanced, in some cases more advanced than the United States. He has theater-sized nuclear weapons that the United States doesn't use or have in our possession. So he may be feeling his oats in one way, and by his calculations, the way war was conducted in the past was kinetic, and he may really truly believe that he's on a path to victory. If you look at the numbers of troops that are moving from Belarus or Russia into this region, into the theater of conflict, they're huge numbers. So far, this has been a traditional land-based operation. Frank, what really concerns me even more than Putin's sanity is what if a mistake is made? I know that's speculation now, and there are, I'm sure, all kinds of preventive measures that the Russians have taken so that there isn't an accidental nuclear launch, but we still have to look at what if.
Yeah, I think the two factors. Number one, and this aggravates me more than anything else, is Putin's current environment a product of our own making? Let's be blunt. Russia is a poor country. Senator John McCain once called Russia a gas station masquerading as a nation. When President Biden, on his first day of office, started to dismantle American energy independence, it was huge financial gift to Vladimir Putin. He is financing this Ukraine event based on the money that he got from Biden's decision to end American energy independence. He looked at Biden's botched withdrawal from Afghanistan and began to think that between the money that he's gotten from Biden and the incompetence of Biden, that perhaps this was the time to move. What he didn't calculate on, and this is where the delusional part perhaps comes in, is the resistance of the Ukrainian people. There are some reports that say that Putin honestly believed that he would be welcomed with flowers and gifts of bread when he walked into Ukraine. Clearly, that was not the case, and Putin, perhaps because of his isolation, never talked to his own advisors and didn't realize what he was getting into. Let's go to your point about how dangerous this is in terms of a potential conflict with the West. As Putin's forces continue to close in, particularly from the east, the Ukrainian forces are going to be pushed further to the west. At some point, they will be right on the border between Poland and Ukraine. Poland will be a conduit for Western weapons going to Ukraine. At some point, some of those transports, perhaps even within Poland itself, will come under attack from Russian forces. At the point where Russian forces attack what they see as supplies to the Ukrainians, coming through Poland, being attacked, that's crossing the red line. The Poles are realists. They've been through this before, not even a century ago. They will retaliate in kind. That's the beginning of World War III.
On top of that, we have to look at NATO's involvement. Once any Russian commits any type of act of war against any nation that's a member state of NATO, under Article 5, we have to respond.
Yeah.
other states are to come to the aid of other member states when they're attacked. I don't think at this point, given the situation, the NATO countries can overlook this fact. They cannot talk it away and say, let's meet in a diplomatic session. They can't say, let's go to the UN Security Council. We've already seen that when that happened, Russia just simply vetoed the measure. So now it's really going to be a case of how carefully, I think, Putin can guide his troops. Again, I'm not agreeing with this, but how carefully he can guide his troops to ensure that no mistakes are made. And, you know, Frank, I think he's already made mistakes. We talked about his miscalculation. We're now seeing in the news coming up, and we will, I'm sure, in the coming days, additional civilian deaths, if you want to call it collateral damage, which sounds to me very inhuman and uncaring. But the reality is there are women and children and non-combatants that are being killed. We've seen pictures of apartment houses that are being bombed. Cities have been told to evacuate civilian areas in the eastern city of Kharkiv. We know these types of things are going to be ongoing, because Russia cannot move in and simply assume power. There are too many Ukrainians willing to stand up for their country, who view themselves as Ukrainian, even in eastern Ukraine, where Putin likes to claim they're Russian descent, therefore they're his people. Plus, as you and I have talked about on the show before, basically anybody who can carry a gun between 18 and 60 something is being given a weapon on the Ukrainian side. They will act as snipers, but unfortunately, they're not going to be militarily trained well enough to necessarily be very careful. So again, there could be an accident on either side that could spark something. We saw in World War I that happened with the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand. That was the precipitating of event, although there were other factors.
Yeah, and it's almost a lose-lose situation, because if the West does do nothing, Putin will take that as weakness on the part of NATO, and it will encourage him to go further. If the West does do something, if NATO does do more in terms of helping the Ukrainians, Putin will see that as a provocation, and again, he'll retaliate as he's promised to do. So I think it's a lose-lose situation as far as the prospects for peace go. There's something else I wanted to bring up to you, as it's in your background at the State Department. We are faced with a ludicrous situation at the United Nations. Russia, as a permanent member of the Security Council, can veto any measure, but Russia is the problem at the United Nations. Are we seeing, perhaps more vividly than ever, the fact that the United Nations has become useless in terms of addressing serious questions of world peace?
At this point, it's a toothless tiger, and it goes beyond the Security Council. If we look at the past few years' record of the United Nations response to human trafficking and abuse, the members of the committee that are supposed to oversee this on human rights are the ones that are committing the abuses. They are becoming members to guard themselves. So what we're seeing is an idea that perhaps after World War II had some merit to it, where nations could talk instead of fighting, but it has deteriorated, as we've seen, especially a number of African nations in the 60s, 70s period become independent, and one nation, one vote has allowed these nations that have been in essence bribed by the communist states to have equal power, as an power of a vote equal to that of the United States. It doesn't make sense to me. You know, we're putting all kinds of money into the United Nations, and we don't even know where it's being spent, Frank. There are just so many abuses at the United Nations today. It is becoming almost like a League of Nations.
Yeah.
I don't know if it's going to shut down, but it's certainly not effective.
Two members of the Security Council, Russia, of course, with its invasion of Ukraine, and China, with increasing human rights violations, not only at home in its own concentration camps, but apparently around the world in areas where it has commercial investment. The latest news comes from Papua New Guinea, where apparently the residents there the citizens there are rising up against Chinese commercial endeavors. We're seeing in Africa mass violations of human rights where Chinese have commercial endeavors going on. And to have those two countries as members of the Security Council with a veto on any activity seems ludicrous. You know, the NATO requirement for membership is that you have a democratic form of government. And you wonder whether a new international organization where perhaps everyone is invited to participate and speak, but that the only ones with veto power would be nations that subscribe to a more democratic government, do not engage in wanton invasions of their neighbors.
You know, it's an interesting idea, but how much of the world is democratic today? How much of the world would just simply see this as a move by the West to overtake or to colonize in one way some of these other nation states? We need to recognize in the West, and I know you agree with me on this, Frank, we need to recognize that many of the states in the country are not up to the standards of the West or the United States.
Well said. Daria, let's go to our first guest. Monica Guzman is the author of I Never Thought of It That Way, How to Have Fearlessly Curious Conversations in Dangerously Divided Times. She's a journalist and entrepreneur and the director of digital and storytelling at Braver Angels. Monica, welcome.
Hi, how are you? Can you hear me okay?
Can hear you great.
Excellent.
It is at a stunningly perilous time, both in the world at large and even within our own nation, as the two sides seem to be further apart than ever. How do we bring them together?
Oh my gosh. Well, the main thing I think we can do to strengthen our democratic republic is to talk with people who disagree with us rather than about them, rather than purely about them. We are getting wrapped up into our own sides. We're listening to all these impressions and frankly misperceptions about the hearts and minds of our neighbors. And we need to do something to fix that. And that's conversation.
Monica, do you think we as a nation state practicing our Constitution way of life have a right to go to other states where there are literally human rights abuses that are unquestionable? Do we have any kind of right as part of the Western world, part of the United Nations? We support the Declaration on International Human Rights. Do we have a right, an ability, should we be going into other states and trying to stop some of these human rights abuses? Or do we say this is part of their culture and their society?
Oof. That's a big question, man. I mean,
you didn't think we were going to let you off easy, did you?
No, but I gotta say, I think that as you know, as humans, whether we're in America or looking beyond our borders, we want to make sure we're taking care of each other. And to the extent that, you know, we can communicate our wisdom, whatever it happens to be, and put it into conversations with other cultures and say, look, this isn't working. This is why we know it's not working. Here's the evidence. This can't go on. And then, of course, you have to turn to diplomacy and other things and try to do it without, you know, getting
what
crazy.
happens, though, when one or both sides then resorts just to threats and name calling? For example, one of the complaints that conservatives have in the United States is that when we ever try to have a conversation with the other side, Republicans and Democrats, is that, well, you don't like this because you're racist or you have special privileges. Vladimir Putin will say to the rest of the world, when we talk about the atrocities he's committing in Ukraine, they're saying, well, you're committing an aggression against the Russian state. You're interfering in our affairs. How do you respond to those type of stock responses that perhaps come from a place not of logic, but of anger?
That's a great question. And one thing I'll say is that anger itself is usually a reason for people to want to stop talking. Anger itself can be data. When we hear others get angry, we know that we have hit on something that really matters to them. And we should be ready for a kind of defensiveness to come up. You know, so when folks say, oh, that's because you're racist, or they bring out some kind of talking point, what I say to that is, are people being curious enough about that assumption? Are they questioning that assumption within themselves? Most of the time, I think when we're angry, we skip over that step. You know, we're not slow and careful with this. Hang on, we're talking to a person. Do we know this person? Do we know their heart? Can we say they're racist? What does that mean for them? What does that mean for me? We tend to speed past that. Now, how you deal with that in a conversation is try not to take the bait to be incurious yourself. So if someone gives you that kind of accusation, ask them, I want to know where that's coming from for you, and see if you can slow it down, turn the temperature down.
I'm teaching at a university right now, and I have a lot of undergrads who are very cautious about expressing teach political science, about speaking their minds. And I start every semester, and I've mentioned this to Frank in the past, I'm teaching you how to think critically, not what to think. And I will defend your right to have your opinion as long as you're respectful of other people's opinions. And what I'm finding from my students is that, well, that's great in your class, but if I hold my opinion outside of your classroom, I'm canceled. How do we get past this in our society where people are hypersensitized to saying the wrong thing and fearing, it's even beyond anger, but really fearing what is going to happen to me if I speak out? Does my professor downgrade me? Do I lose my job? Is my family at risk? How do we get past it?
I think the key word, you said it, is fear. Right now, we are far too afraid of what we think we see on the other side. And we have made these decisions among our tribes. You know, when you hear that sort of, it sounds innocent. What it really means is that this person is terrible. So, oh my gosh, as soon as you hear the innocent thing, shame them. You know, it all comes from a good place of everyone's just trying to get our culture onto a place where we feel like we're being good people. And this is a very tense time where there's just conflict everywhere around that. So how we get past that is what I said in the beginning. We've got to talk with people we disagree with, not from a place of immediate judgment, but from a place of curiosity. Because once you see who people really are, you start to understand that all these like quick accusations are just wrong. They're just wrong, even if they're right a little bit. The majority of the time, we're being reckless because of the monsters we perceive, but we're just people.
Has our ability to do just what you said been strangled? Because going back to the colleges and universities, the entire concept of cancel culture is not to talk out your problems, not to talk out your differences, but to just immediately shut down the other side. No, you make me feel bad by what you're saying, therefore, we're not going to have this conversation. You know, one of the differences, I think, from when Daria and I were younger, were in universities, was that two sides would argue against each other vehemently. But at the end, the saving grace I always found was that I think you're an idiot. I think your points of view are totally wrong. You're terrible, but I would die for your right to say it. Now the perception is, now what you hear is, you're wrong, I disagree with you, and I'm going to censor you. I'm going to make sure no one hears your opinion. If that's the case, then we just retreat into two opposing camps with no opportunity to really work out our differences.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. We can't do that. And we have been doing it, and it's reactionary. And I see signals that it's slowing down. Others may agree or disagree with that. But I do think that even on college campuses, there are a lot of people saying, wait a minute, where is inquiry? Where is the process of letting ideas speak to each other? People's fear is well-founded. Again, I'll go back to that whole thing of what's going on in our world. A lot of anxiety, a lot of changes, a lot of norms have been upended. And sometimes the simplest thing is just to make a hard and fast rule and shame everyone into following it. Otherwise, we have to deal with the complexity and nuance of things. That's difficult. That's really difficult because it makes us have to implicate ourselves, question ourselves, wonder if we're good people. People would rather just say, no, you're good, you're bad, let's move on. But that's costing us precisely for the reasons you say. We're not going to be one society with this diversity of thought that's so beautiful and a part of our culture, unless we learn to really like stand and listen and receive even the things that we might think are unsavory, look beneath them, really explore those ideas and where they came from. And you may find that it's not as scary as you think.
One of the things I've seen is that one half of the country wants to, and this is true for both sides, one half of the country wants the other half of the country not to talk. not to express themselves. Go away. Just stop this. I don't want to hear it anymore.
Yeah.
To me, we have wonderful, incredible, free thinking individuals in this country. And if we cut out half the population, be it left or right or up or down, whatever divisions you want to make, we've lost those creative minds. And what I'm seeing today in high schools, for one example, in Connecticut, I visited a high school to give a talk. And I was told that it was going to be a political club. And I said, well, is it the high school Democrats or the high school Republicans? And they said, oh, no, we put them both together because we don't want to have any divisions. And I was just absolutely floored by that, because to me, when I was in school, the Republicans would debate the Democrats and you come up with your strong points and your weak ones. And a lot of times there was compromise involved. And there was a third opinion that showed up that was better than either side was first proposing. How do we get back to that point where we're no longer afraid to debate and debate hard about the issues without personal attacks?
What I think of there is how we hold on to our own beliefs. So right now, thanks to social media and the ways we communicate, we've gotten to this ethic of the moment, that what you believe right now, what you put on Twitter, what you put on Facebook is all I need to know about you. That's all I need to be able to judge you, right? But the truth is far more complex. So what we need to do is take those beliefs, not hold them any looser, in that they're still our convictions, they're still our beliefs. We need to bring that passion. But can we kind of just allow a little bit of space in between them when we come into a conversation, so that we do not believe that we are our beliefs, we are our opinions, so that someone is criticizing our beliefs, we think they're criticizing us, the shields go up, and we're going to go nowhere from there. So what we need to do is just take a little step back. And there's questions we can ask ourselves to do that, including, what would it take to change my mind on this issue? What is my biggest concern on this issue that has led me to this belief? When you identify that, you can say, I see what's going on here. And then if someone else comes up, you can say, I'm curious what their biggest concern is about this issue. They might share their concern and you're like, I get that. That makes sense. And you're allowing a little bit of breath, a little bit of air in between yourself and your beliefs. And I think only then will we be able to get to the point where we're not just thinking that every time we debate ideas, we're debating our own validity as people. We're not debating our validity as people.
I have one more. How do we get past the point of feeling bad about ourselves as a country? Because for me, I see dramatic changes from 1776 in our history to now. We are making progress. We're on a pathway. Yet it seems that some people make the assumption, like you said earlier, it's black and white, it's right or wrong. How do we get people to see those nuances, that we're a good country, we're learning, we're progressing, and we're better than we were?
Yeah, I mean, I look to history. This is not the first time that we've been bitterly divided. It has happened before. We had a civil war where 700,000 Americans died around division, and we somehow survived that. We somehow grew stronger as a culture, and you can trace what we learn about what it means to be together and to thrive together over and over again. That's the beauty of this country. Now, what I will say is, for the many folks who really want to keep the focus on our problems, that comes from a good place. It's because those problems do need to be looked at. What's unfortunate is that it's now become this fight of we're good or we're bad. Hang on. That's not what really matters. What matters is, what are we doing? Are we doing it together? Are we trying to optimize this society for everyone who's in it, no matter what their ideologies, no matter where they come from and who they are?
Have we kind of destroyed ourselves to some extent with social media and even cable channels that allow us to tailor our intake of information to only those sources that we agree with? You could set up on Facebook or on any of the social media, I'm going to block anyone who says something I don't agree with. So all we're hearing is an echo chamber. And once someone comes from outside that echo chamber, they're bad, they're terrible, I'm going to cancel them out. Even on TV, perhaps at a time when we all gathered around the evening news when there was like 3 or 4 channels, now we've got 100 channels and we can only watch the channels that agree with our point of view. Have we forgotten how to listen to somebody else's point of view because of that.
Yeah, I think it absolutely makes it harder. And, a temptation for all of us, I think, is to wait for the media to fix this, wait for our politicians to fix this. And what I say is we can't afford to do that. We have to fix it ourselves. We have to compensate for these divisive silos that we end up in, and understand that, look, this is the economics of the media industry. This is the economics of the campaign industry. They need our attention, and the way they get our attention is by knowing how we feel, speaking right to that. And that's fine, except that it traps us into these places where everything outside of what we're hearing seems even more alien and awful than it really is. And the social science research keeps showing us that we are vastly exaggerating our divisions, vastly exaggerating our fear, right? But I just don't think we can count on, the media and politics to be able to actually calm us down. We're going to have to do that ourselves. And I think it is in part, you can be on social media. You really can have great conversations on social media, but you have to understand the limitations. How much of the human toolbox of communication you are restricted to. Words and maybe a couple of emojis, really? And you're supposed to talk about something really serious? So what I do is, if I'm on a Facebook thread or a Twitter thread and stuff's getting real, I either say, you know what, I really appreciate having heard from you. I think I'm going to stop here. Or I say, hey, you want to pick up the phone? You want to get on a Zoom call? You can change the conditions of the conversation to make the conversation more likely to be a curious and productive one. It can happen, but you'll have to dial it up because Twitter won't tell you to get off and pick up the phone. That's for sure.
Now, I've got one. Oh, go ahead, Frank.
Go ahead, Daria.
I've got one for you about brick and mortar. I know social media is really important, but we're seeing something happen in this country that has never happened before. And I think it's more long-term. People from the certain areas of the country, when they find themselves in a different political situation than the majority of the people in that area, are choosing to move to other parts of the country.
Yes.
Now, it's one thing if you make a move and can move back, but the reality is selling a house, relocating families, children, jobs, these are long-term changes that are here. And just like you said, if you're only listening to your own group, you don't hear anything else. Are we dividing into pockets that really are long-term and it can be hard to change again?
Yeah. And I mean, that's up to us, right? It is happening. There's been a lot of really concerning coverage about blue zip codes getting bluer and red zip codes getting redder. And I get it. I know several people, both sides, who have made recent moves. They say it's the pandemic. Sure, it's the pandemic, but it's also, man, it sure doesn't, it doesn't bother me that people where I'm going agree with me more. And that makes a lot of sense because, again, we want to be, in scary, anxious times, we want to be comfortable. Nobody wants to be constantly provoked all the time. It is really difficult to be a political minority in a place where you live today. It is really difficult. I mean, my parents, talked to me about, man, when we got here, being Republican, Democrat, no big deal, whatever. Now, they're Republicans and they were in the Seattle area, and boy, oh boy, did they feel it, right? They've moved to North Carolina. Do they mind that it's more purple and it's more accepting of their views? Not at all. So what we're going to have to do is, here's what I think it means. It means that those moments where we have rituals where we come together, we travel to be together, whether it's Thanksgiving, Christmas, family ties are still there. Those moments become all the more critical for some kind of exchange of views. The moments on social media, which is for some families, the places where they actually interact and exchange, it's going to be that much more important that we can look generously, right, at Aunt Sue, who once again posted some kind of outrageous thing. And we're sitting here going, gee, Aunt Sue, why did you post that? And it's like, okay, go from being confounded by that to actually being curious. Why did she post that? Why is she so angry? What is it that really concerns her about this issue she posted about? And next time you call her, I don't know, maybe there's time and maybe you can have attention and maybe you can actually talk about it and understand her a little bit more.
So what you're saying is very positive. What I'm hearing from a lot of young people is just the opposite, that they don't have hope. They don't think it can get better. How does either an older or a middle level age of population support the young people that have been going through COVID with dislocations? Now we've got Ukraine going on. The world just looks like it's falling apart to them. How do we give them the hope that this is possible?
Yeah, well, one of the things is to remember that young people always come in with a lot of energy. I keep seeing it. It's wonderful to hang out with high schoolers and college kids these days because they're looking around, stepping into this world that we've made for them, going, well, this doesn't work. you know, and where hopelessness maybe for other generations really does, it's you feel closer to resignation. I don't see that with them, honestly. I see them looking around going, okay, we're gonna have to do something, right? So there's organizations like Bridge USA, the Millennial Action Project, all kinds of organizations pulling young people together to look around and say, well, we're not going to accept this. We're going to find a better way because that's what we need. But how others can give each other hope is, share the stories of understanding. Just the other day, someone was telling me that they saved a friendship that was really on the rocks after 14 years because of severe political disagreements, and that they finally figured out some ways to change the way they were having conversations. And they feel like we're friends again. This is great. So it can happen. And I really think it's at that small level that it matters the most. It's at that small scale. It's the one-to-one relationships. It's actually hearing out, your parents or your kids. It's being able to have the conversations without screaming. And it's even smaller than that. It's the moment where you're in conversation with someone, you disagree, you start getting angry, and you get to that point where you just want to say your opinion. You just want to defend your opinion, but instead you ask one more question. You ask how they came to their beliefs, and you ask them to tell a story, or you ask them about those concerns and those values underneath. And if you just give yourself that one extra question, a couple more minutes to sit with what they believe, whatever you say back is going to be a lot more calm and a lot more productive.
I wonder to some extent, there used to be overarching loyalties. We were patriotic Americans, to take just one national perspective. And whatever differences we had, we'd say in the long run, well, we're all part of the same team, we're all part of the same country. Now it seems that some folks have more loyalty to their political party than to the country as a whole, and more being reduced back to a tribalistic existence where it's my little village against your little village, rather than we're all part of a greater whole, whether that's your country or Western civilization. And it seems that hasn't that really aggravated the issue tremendously?
Oh, 100%. Absolutely. It's the lack of a shared identity, right? It's these smaller identities that have such a grip on us, our psyche, our emotions, again, for good reason. Meanwhile, the American identity, I mean, goodness, no one can even agree what it is, right? But what I would say to that is you can look at that as a negative and say, no one can agree what the American identity is. Oh no, let's despair. Or you can say, we're in this process of reinventing it. We're in this process of trying to figure out what it is today. And that's going to take some negotiation, because what I really love that comes from the conservative point of view is whenever there's moments of transition, really one of the most important questions you can ask to try to figure out what should change is to ask, what should stay the same? What do we need to preserve? What is at the core of who we are? And I find that the conservative mindset is really, really great for helping to pinpoint that and what we ought to preserve. And then the liberal mindset is more like, let's change everything. Let's change this. But it's really, you got to bring the two together. We're going to have to bring the two together really constructively to figure out what it means to be American and build that shared identity again.
Monica Guzman's book is, I never thought of it that way, How to Have Fearlessly Curious Conversations in Dangerously Divided Times. How can our viewers find out more about you, get your book, and read your material?
Well, the book comes out March 8th. So it's just a week from now, and go to reclaimcuriosity.com to learn more about how to pre-order it, or find me on Twitter at Moni Guzman. And I promise I will not fight with you too bad if we disagree on social media.
That's great. Monica, hope to speak again.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Take care.
Frank, I just got to say this. One of the things I've always said is so much of what she's talking about, we've got to listen to the other side. It's interesting to see someone who's from a more liberal perspective that can understand that conservatives do want to conserve what's good, but still have progress.
Absolutely right. And I think the various attacks based on cancel culture or attacks even on the First Amendment are doing exact opposite of what Monica was saying. New York Senator Chuck Schumer wanted to say pass legislation or enacted legislation, introduce legislation, I'm sorry, which would limit the application of the First Amendment. These attacks on free speech are just disastrous, whether they're coming from a legislator like Senator Schumer or whether they're occurring on a college campus, which says that if your opinion upsets somebody else, we're just going to cancel you out and not talk to you at all.
Well, you know what? The Chinese have a word, luan, that means chaos. They think that this country is chaos, and at all costs, they fight it in their own country. They take it to the extreme that you cannot have your own personal opinion. You only can have the opinion that the state has, and that's the only justified one. We're moving closer and closer to that. You and I have talked about how on campuses, there's free speech zones where certain areas are protected so you can have free speech. You and I talked about how this used to be called the United States, and now it's a squared off room or fenced in area. You know, it's just gotten ridiculous in this country how we have actually been willing to accept a lack of free speech.
Let's go to our next guest. Greg Roman is the former political advisor to the Deputy Foreign Minister of Israel. He has also worked for the Israeli Ministry of Defense. He is director of the Middle East Forum. He warns that Biden should beware of Russia and Qatar because haggling with dictators to secure the free world's energy supply is bad policy. Greg, welcome to the program.
Thanks for having me.
We, as a country, went from energy independence just about a year and a half ago to relying on Qatar and on Russia for our energy supplies. How big of a challenge does that present?
So I don't think it's sole reliance on foreign powers where we're sitting right now, but I think we're definitely in a much weaker position from the start of the Biden administration. And more than that, this administration has taken positions to de-incentivize American companies from tapping our resources here at home. Taxes are up. Incentives and tax breaks to develop new liquid natural gas terminals are down. The ability to transport our gas from Canada or from the Gulf to ports on the East and the West Coast are down. And more than that, we've given no incentives for other countries that are alliances, other fellow democracies, to be able to develop their own gas infrastructure. Because it doesn't just take the driller to be able to supply the gas. It also takes a country to have the infrastructure to be able to use the gas. So those four things have put us in a much more precarious situation, especially when situations like what's happening in Ukraine right now develop. And now we're left tapping into our emergency supplies rather than becoming the alternate source for energy for Europe.
Greg, I've never understood the perspective of the Biden administration in closing off the Keystone pipeline and then asking the Russians or the Iranians or the Qatar for their oil. Last I checked, Russia, China, the United States, Qatar, they're all on the same planet. So how is it improving the environment of the planet if instead of American oil, we're using Russian oil?
Well, it's not that we're using Russian oil. Like, let's get that straight first. It's about Europe being a client, a hydrocarbon energy client of Russia rather than the United States. And if we're just looking at fossil fuels in general, I agree with the general idea that we should probably go to nuclear, go to renewable, go to solar, whatever else. We don't want to tap all of our oil and gas resources because A, maybe we'll need it for the future. B, there's the fact it pollutes. But if we are in a world that exists, that is reality rather than 100 years from now when we have technology to be able to be 100% on renewables, you have to take the energy resources that you're dealt with. So you have to focus first on your ability to control supply so you don't be subject to the demand of what happens when we have these emergency situations. And these countries that you mentioned, except for the United States, they use their energy resources as a weapon rather than using it as a tool for good. And when the U.S. had its own development, its own natural development of its own energy supplies, we let the market rule the forces. We didn't commit to any cartels or any illegal monopolies like the Qataris and the Russians have with the Association of Gas Exporting Countries or through OPEC. We let the market control it. We let our free enterprise develop our own resources, and we were reliant on ourselves, no one else. That's the only thing countries can do to protect themselves. The first, look inwards at home. If they can't find the resources there, to look out.
I find this a bit of pie in the sky attitude towards some of the folks who are trying to prevent America from exploiting its own resources. It's as if, and I've used this analogy on the show before, in 1776, someone had said, horses are smelly and hard to maintain. Why don't we shoot them all? Because in 100 years, they'll develop the automobile. Aren't we in sort of the same situation when we attack fossil fuels now, knowing that solar and wind at best can only produce 20% of our energy needs?
No, you look at a bridge, right? You say, let's use the resources that we have available, but in the long run, understand that those resources one day will tap out. In a long while, it could be 1,000 years from now, it could be 500, it could be 100, but that's up for scientists to decide. And it's not up for politicians to politicize the science behind energy, right? This is sort of the idea where Germany let politicians decide the future of their energy policy. They said under Angela Merkel, who was chancellor for 14 years, she said, you know what? We've got a good relationship with Russia. Russia has a lot of natural gas. We can rely on them for the Novograd 2 pipeline. And what she did is she shut down all of her nuclear plants. And now Europe's in a situation today because they became dependent on a totalitarian state. Versus what she could have done, which is to say, you know what, I can modernize my nuclear infrastructure. I can maybe turn towards the United States for my natural gas. And she could have diversified her energy supply between renewables and fossil fuels. That seems like the more responsible outcome, to meet the short-term needs that people have, and then to gradually develop into a way in which the economy can replace the energy itself. Rather than being on a forced timeline, they should be on a timeline that's good for both the worker and for the environment in the long run.
Recently, we've seen that China and Russia have signed de-energy deals in addition to their Eastern Siberian pipelines that are already in existence. With Russia's willingness to sell or China's willingness to buy Russia's energy resources, how much is this going to impact the world politically in the future if one communist regime, in essence, is supporting the other when it comes to energy? China needs energy to mature. It seems like they just got a bunch, if you want to use that term, from Russia from this deal recently. Do we need to worry about the two of them working together on energy against the world?
I think you need to worry about the Russians and the Chinese getting closer writ large, not just on energy, but in most areas of development. National security, their ability to take their own client states, whether it be their relationship with Iran, their relationship with African countries, their relationship even with South America, and to try to replace the U.S. dominance in those areas with a Chinese-Russian bloc. But at the end of the day, the Chinese aren't going to be able to manufacture enough products to just suit the Russian market. And the Russians are going to provide enough energy to China, but it's surely not enough to run the Russian economy. They require the cooperation of other countries. So that's why you have Chinese banks all of a sudden now cutting back on their dealings with Russian corporate entities because they don't want to be subject to the same economic controls and sanctions which the West is now putting on them. At the end of the day, China's market is the world, right? All of its little trinkets, its cheaper products, its manufactured parts, and even its quest for rare earth minerals needs a market. That market's not Russia. So if we make China choose between doing business with the West and doing business with Russia, it's in China's interest to keep on dealing with us on our terms rather than thinking they could go it alone with Russia.
How exactly? Go ahead, Daria.
Just sort of a follow-up. We're seeing now that in Tajikistan, the Chinese are very concerned about Uyghurs that are there, what's going on with the Taliban. At the same time, Russia's very concerned with this area over the Cosmodrome, missile sites, different space technologies that are in Tajikistan, or operations, I should say, that are still very important to the Russians. we're starting to see some small breaks in, I think, in the China-Russia relationship where it's no longer convenient, and there's starting to be certain places where we're seeing some competition. Do you see Central Asia as a hot spot between Russia and China potentially in the future?
I do. They have their disagreements over the Caspian Sea, disagreements to do with North Korea. They have their disagreements on who's going to have more influence in Mongolia. On one hand, you have, 1,000-year Chinese presence in the country at the time of the Khan, versus on the other hand, you have the Russian influence with the Communist Party going back to 1918. So there's a lot of potential areas for conflict between the two. I think Ukraine is an area of conflict. Chinese political identity is, for the last 30 years, since Tiananmen, embraced this idea of state sovereignty is the highest nominal global value overall. Whatever a country wants to, it's fine so long as it takes place within its own borders. And here comes Russia and invades Ukraine, which has pretty good economic relations with China. At least it did prior to the invasion 5 or 6 days ago. And now China's put between a rock and a hard place. Will it, to its national political identity and its values that it's espoused for 3 decades, or will it put the Russian-Chinese relationship first and say, you know what, we didn't actually mean what we were talking about? And it puts them in a very uncomfortable spot. Just now, thousands of Chinese are being evacuated from Ukraine because they've woken up to the reality that the Russians aren't messing around. But on the other hand, Chinese companies are going to be the ones to suffer if they keep on doing business with Russia. So there's a lot of fissures there to exploit. And unless President Biden and the West drives those fissures with huge Mack trucks and tries to blow up that relationship, then I think it's our opportunity to lose on.
Now, coming up right now, it's the Chinese annual National Party Congress along with their consultative Congress, early March period. One of the items on the agenda is Ukraine, the Ukraine-Russian situation. If you had to make a prediction post-March where China is going in relation to Russia, do you think that we're going to see a continuing split, if you will, or start of a split, or do you think they will mend their ways, get over Ukraine, and reunite? It seems that neither country has many allies.
Well, China actually has many allies. China has bought off somewhere between 60 to 70 different countries and has extraction rights to their rare earth minerals, to their natural markets. And they've literally bought the largest ports in some countries like Sri Lanka and in Kenya. Those ports have gone bankrupt, and the Chinese were collecting on them on pennies on the dollar. So in the Silk Road policy, the brick and road policy that they've had for the last 10, 15 years, the Chinese have a lot of allies and have a lot of control. So I wouldn't worry so much about Chinese influence. What I would worry about is that if the Chinese think that they have more to gain from aligning themselves with Russia, the West has to be ready to respond with even more devastating sanctions against Russia and also countries that do business with Russia. They both have to be felt as international pariahs. And I think that the more that the West does now prior to the Congress, the answer to your question, to your hypothetical, is that China will only go as far away from Russia as the West drives it away from Russia. That means the West has to increase the price of doing business with Russia to the point where the Chinese urge diplomacy rather than occupation and invasion.
Geographically, by population, by industrial might, even by economy, a combination of Russia and China is by far the largest and most serious opponent the United States and the West in general has ever faced. Yet when I look at some of the analyses of defense policy, I see no realization of that fact. In fact, it seems to be largely ignored, particularly if you look at things like, well, the Biden defense budget request of last year, which actually cut the Pentagon by about 3% in terms of real purchasing power. Why does the American public, does the Biden administration seem so unread on that entire issue?
When the German government commits to not just increase its defense budget, by 100 billion euros to basically supercharge their ability to meet the Russian threat in their backyard, but also goes against their constitutional norms for the first time since World War II and allows for the export of offensive weaponry to be used in defense of the West. And you're the president of the United States and you haven't made similar adjustments to your defense policy, you're in a little bit of a pickle. If President Biden does not announce a dramatic expansion of the United States Navy and our land forces and commitment in Europe during the State of the Union, which is scheduled to take place soon, I think that we're going to be way behind, even way behind Europe, which is something that is unfathomable. You know, President Trump spent the better part of 4 years asking that European members of NATO meet their minimum 2% of GDP spend on their national budgets on defense programs. Germany's there now. We didn't get there because of President Trump, though. We got there because Germany woke up and realized that the Russian bear was at their doorstep. If the U.S. doesn't back them, European countries might find it more convenient to either go off on their own third way for defense or to potentially not cooperate as much with the United States as we're used to in the past.
You know, if we look at supposed reasons of Putin moving into the former Warsaw Pact area, we see that in, I believe it was 2008, in the country of Georgia, two small provinces, South Ossetia and Abkhazia, Russian troops go in. Georgia no longer qualifies for membership or full membership in NATO. With Crimea being attacked, we see that the Ukraine no longer can qualify currently for membership in NATO. Putin knows what he's doing. He's moving into Ukraine. Do you think it's going to stop there? He's made the pretense that it's because of these states turning to the West. But how far do you think he will actually go in an attempt to recreate a sort of a modern Russian empire?
Well, I don't think that he's creating empire. I think he's creating elbow room for what he sees as the West's encroachment on traditional Russian territories. Georgia being the first, and well, it's actually, if we go all the way back, it's Chechnya, where he started off in Grozny, right when he was prime minister, right? Prior to him being elected back in 2000. Then it was Georgia 8 years later. It was Ukraine 6 years later, Crimea, Ukraine, and Donbass. And now it's the rest of the country. His goal, or his original goal in this operation, was to stop the westward tilt that Ukraine has taken since the downfall of Viktor Yanukovych, the former president of Ukraine, in 2014. And he was trying to get back to a modicum of having a Russian-friendly government in Kiev. Since the fact is that his lightning attack on Kiev ended up turning to a 3-mile-a-day sprawl. And now he's going to be in the washes of a Ukrainian insurgency, which I think is what you're seeing happen now, especially with close to 80,000 Ukrainian men of fighting age soldiers returning to the country over the last week. His soldiers are in for a big, big surprise. And we know that Russians, when you have an active population fighting their occupation of a country, don't do well. All Afghanistan, 1979 until 1988, 1989. He's in real trouble. And if he isn't given an off-ramp by the West, perhaps withdrawing from Ukraine for the alleviation of sanctions, perhaps keeping the Donbass and paying for Ukrainian reconstruction, you're going to see Putin slowly but surely lose his grip from power in the Kremlin, as many other Russian leaders have when they have gone on geopolitical exercises which inevitably failed. It happened to Khrushchev, happened to Stalin, happened to Brezhnev, happened to Gorbachev, even happened to Yeltsin post-Soviet Union. So his group of influencers, his oligarchs, his generals, the titans of industry around him, otherwise known as Slovaki, they'll make the decision on what happens to Putin, but he has no winning options right now.
In ancient Rome, it was the Praetorian Guard that eventually would take out an emperor that went a little bit too far. Is there a Praetorian Guard in the Kremlin that has the ability or the courage to take out Vladimir Putin?
I don't think any of the Russians have courage. I think all of them have ability. I think at the end of the day, they're looking at their bottom line. And when you have these oligarchs who have been surrounding him and make billions of dollars a year for the past 22 years of him being in control, it'll be the same people who kept him in power, which will remove him from power. As soon as their bottom line goes down, he has a lot less worth to them than he did when he was making them their billions.
I just got a quick question. Do you think what Putin is doing today is going to inspire other nations that feel oppressed to rise up against their leaderships?
I don't think so. I think, if anything, this is a wake-up call for Europe to realize that all their hopes and dreams of having a peaceful, pacified, sort of utopia of Europe without violence, without political repercussions, without any major actions since Bosnia and Serbia and Kosovo in the late 90s is a dream, which is, I'm just going to say that way, it's a fantasy. And I think, if anything, this has the potential for those countries which have oppressive leaders to look towards Europe and to look towards the West as the way in which countries get together when they're facing a tyrant. And if anything, if Biden does the right thing, he'll make Europe and the United States and the other NATO countries, along with Southeast Asia, like, let's not forget Australia, Israel, some of our Arab neighbors, some of Israel's Arab neighbors, other American Arab allies, they're looking to the U.S. for leadership, and now is our time to shine. If we don't meet that standard, it's our, like I said beforehand, opportunity to fail.
Greg, where can our viewers find out more about you and read your work?
Sure. So most of the stuff that I do is on the Middle East. So that's Morocco to Iran, Turkey down to Djibouti. Sometimes opine on what's going on in Central Asia, like we spoke about, and Eastern Europe. You can find my writing at meforum.org, or you can see my 140-character opinions on Twitter at Greg, G-R-E-G-G, Roman, R-M-A-N.
Thanks so much. We look forward to our next conversation.
Thank you very much.
And to our viewers, thanks for tuning in.
We welcome our newest radio affiliate in Washington, D.C. at 96.7 FM. Watch us on Roku, public broadcast stations, and on the AM/FM 24/7 network. Tell Alexa to open the network and play our show. You can also access the program on our website at usagovpolicy.com. Join us again next week. We're sponsored by the New York Analysis of Policy and Government, a division of the American Analysis of News and Media, Inc., and the Institute for American Politics. Email us at truthinradio@gmail.com.
Our producer is the amazing Abigail White, and our director is the brilliant Jeff Hansen.